Barbara Hagler again. Welcome back to Living in Hope Storytime. And as you remember, we were reading Speedy Steve, the Rocket Rabbit, and we had just gotten through the first 2 chapters. So today we're going to read chapters 3 and 4. But I wanted to show you a picture of Hope Farm. This is Hope Farm. These are some of the other animals that we had on Hope Farm that you can that are in some of our other chapter books. And I even have a picture up on the mantle of Hope Farm. It's a special picture. I'll tell you more about that next time. But let's get back to our story. If you remember, we were with Steve, and Steve was called Speedy Steve, wasn't he? Because he hopped and ran so fast. He was the fastest animal on Hope Farm, he thought. And then he heard about a township run that was coming up on July 4th, and he was really interested in being a part of that run. But Steve had a little bit of a problem, didn't he? He was always trying to steal food from Farmer Dan's garden. And remember, there was a Speedy mistake, and Speedy Steve got caught under the tractor of Farmer Dan's wagon. Okay, so this next chapter, chapter 3, is a bad turn. Farmer Dan jumped off the tractor and came around the back of the yard wagon. Steve was trying to get his paw out from under the wheel. "Rabbit, I just knew your speed was going to get you in trouble one day. What were you trying to do? Get into the garden again?" Farmer Dan shook his head as he quickly lifted the wheel off Steve's leg. Steve lay in the grass, panting and dazed. He couldn't move. Farmer Dan gently lifted Steve, carried him over, and laid him underneath a bush in the yard, where he knew the rabbits had their home. Sure enough, a few minutes later, Steve's mother arrived. Rita had run to find her. Steve was glad to see his mother. Even cocky, speedy rabbits like Steve want their moms when they're hurt. You like the story too, don't you, Sherwood? "Oh, Stephen, what have you done now?" she asked as she carefully looked at his foot. "I'm sorry, Mom. I think I broke my foot. I can't move it. Now how will I run in the race?" he asked, tears streaming into his whiskers. "I'm not worried about that old race. I'm worried about how you will hop with a broken foot. Does it hurt much?" she asked worriedly. Not too much," he stuttered. Rita helped Steve's mom make a soft bed for him to lie on under the honeysuckle bush. "Maybe if you rest a couple of days, you'll still be able to run," said Rita, hoping to make Steve feel better. "Yeah, maybe." But Steve was worried. He knew his foot was hurt badly. He had seen the look on his mother's face. What if he couldn't hop again? Was he ever going to get to run again? Oh, why did he have to be so cocky? Why did he always want to steal Farmer Dan's garden food? For that's what it was, stealing. He had taken what didn't belong to him and treated it as a joke. He was surprised Farmer Dan even helped him today. Steve hung his head. Forgiveness. That's the next one chapter, chapter 4. When Steve awoke, it was morning. Farmer Dan was sitting on the sunset bench near the honeysuckle bush. Here, let me turn this so you can see it better. The sunset bench was a bench the farmer's children had given to Farmer Dan and his wife for their anniversary one year. They had placed the bench in the backyard of Hope Farm when they moved there so they could sit on it and watch the sunset in the evenings. The first summer they lived on the farm, they were constantly working during the day, but they took time most evenings to sit on the bench to watch the sun setting in the sky. Farmer Dan and his wife loved how God seemed to paint the sky with the most beautiful colors at sunset time. Steve knew that sometimes Farmer Dan would take a break during the day and sit on the bench for a moment to talk to God about something that bothered him. The bench happened to be near the honeysuckle bush where the rabbits lived, and they heard Farmer Dan pray aloud many times. Today, as Steve lay under the bush recovering, he heard Farmer Dan coming out to sit on the bench. Only today, Farmer Dan first stooped and looked at Steve under the bush. Steve's heart began to pound because he knew he couldn't run away from the man today. He couldn't even hop away. But Farmer Dan had looked at him and said, "So, you're still alive then? I was afraid I might have killed you with that wagon. I hope you'll be able to get up and hop again." Now Steve knew Farmer Dan didn't know that he and the other animals understood him, so he knew that Farmer Dan was talking out loud to himself. But Steve's heart stopped pounding as Farmer Dan turned away and took his seat on the bench. He had been sitting there quietly ever since. Just then Farmer Dan began to pray, and Steve began to listen. "Lord," said Farmer Dan, "I'm sorry this morning for hurting this little rabbit here." Steve couldn't believe it. Farmer Dan was telling God he was sorry for hitting Steve, even though Steve stole from the farmer's garden every chance he could. Farmer Dan continued, You've warned me before, Lord, that my sometimes reckless speed and hurry to get my farm chores done would cause problems. I never thought, though, that I might hurt one of your creatures. I am sorry. I don't think that rabbit can forgive me, so I'm asking you, Lord, to forgive my impatience. That's all, Lord. Thank you for hearing me because of your friend and my friend, Jesus." Farmer Dan sat quietly for a few moments. Then he suddenly stood up and headed to the barn like he had something to do. Steve lay on his bed thinking about what he had just heard. Steve and all the animals knew they were God's creatures, and as such they knew there were ways they were supposed to behave. Steve knew that he had crossed the line one too many times. He had stolen from Farmer Dan's garden and had been way too sure of himself. Pride. That was one of those things God didn't like in people or in his animals. Farmer Dan had talked about reckless speed. Suddenly Steve knew even his love of speed was reckless and prideful. He thought he was better than everyone else just because he was a fast rabbit. Well, he had been fast. Steve was sorry for his pride, not just because he was hurt, but because he had hurt others with his attitude and actions. Steve, too, prayed for forgiveness. He couldn't communicate with Farmer Dan to apologize to him, so he apologized to God. He told God he was sorry and knew God had hurt him. Okay, that's where we're going to stop for today at the end of chapter 4. So Steve and Farmer Dan both asked for forgiveness, didn't they? They knew that they needed that. Well, there's some more good chapters coming up, so stay tuned. Thanks again.